On July 17, 2024, the Secretary of the Navy stood at a podium in California and cleared the criminal records of 258 men. Most of them had been dead for decades. None of them had ever asked for a pardon, because a pardon forgives guilt, and these men had insisted for 80 years that they were never guilty of anything. What the Navy did that day was rarer than a pardon. It admitted it had been wrong. To understand why the United States government needed exactly 80 years to say 4 words, we have to go back to the same date, the same 17th of July, but in 1944, because that is the night this story actually starts, with an explosion so large it registered as an earthquake nearly 50 miles away, felt on the ground more than 400 miles from where it happened, with 320 American sailors who died in about 2 seconds, most of their bodies never recovered in any form that could be buried, and with 50 men who survived that night who were then ordered to walk back onto the same pier and do it again, under the same conditions, with nothing fixed. By 1942, the United States Navy needed one thing more than almost anything else in the Pacific War: ammunition, moving fast, in enormous quantities, toward ships that could not fight without it. Port Chicago, a small town on the shore of Suisun Bay, northeast of San Francisco, was chosen to be one of the places that ammunition passed through, because it had deep water, rail access, and enough distance from any major city that if something went wrong, the Navy's own planning documents noted, fewer people would be killed. The Navy that built this depot was, by official policy, still living in 1922, the year it had formally restricted black enlisted men to the steward's branch, cooking, cleaning, and serving officers, and nothing else. The desperate manpower needs of a two-ocean war forced the Navy to open general service to black recruits starting in 1942, but general service turned out to mean something very specific in practice. Black sailors were still kept out of combat assignments, still kept off the ships doing the actual fighting, and funneled instead into the most physically dangerous labor the Navy had to offer on the home front. At Port Chicago, that meant one job, and one job only: loading. White officers would supervise from a safe distance up the pier. Neither group would receive any real training in handling high explosives, because there was a war on, and training took time the Navy did not think it had. To understand what happened at Port Chicago, you first have to understand what the job actually looked like, because the word loading undersells what these men were doing every single night. Divisions of roughly 100 black sailors each worked 12-hour shifts, moving 500-pound bombs, torpedo warheads, incendiaries, and depth charges off rail cars, onto rope cargo nets, and down into the holds of cargo ships bound for the Pacific. Civilian stevedores who had handled explosives professionally before the war and briefly worked alongside the sailors were reportedly horrified at what they saw. There was no formal handling procedure. There was, instead, competition. White officers timed the divisions against each other on chalkboards and posted the results, turning the movement of live ordnance into a contest for bragging rights, cash side bets, and extra liberty passes for whichever division cleared its rail cars fastest. Damaged shell casings were carried anyway. Detonators were sometimes still attached. Men who had never seen a bomb before basic training were now stacking them by hand in the dark, sweating through their uniforms in the California heat, racing a stopwatch held by an officer standing safely up the pier, because a slower division meant a longer shift and a captain's disapproval, and a faster one meant a few hours of liberty in town that night. Among the sailors working those shifts was a 23-year-old seaman first class named Joseph Small, from Charleston, South Carolina, quiet, well-liked, and already regarded by the men around him as someone worth listening to, though he never asked for that role and would spend the rest of his life insisting he never had it. Small had voiced concerns about the loading practices before July of 1944, telling anyone who would listen that the men needed real training and that racing live ordnance for a liberty pass was going to get somebody killed. So had other men, in their own divisions, in their own words. Officers listened, nodded, and changed nothing, because the ships kept needing to leave on schedule, and the schedule was the only thing anyone with the authority to slow this down was actually being measured against. On the night of July 17, 1944, at 18 minutes past 10, the SSEA Bryan was moored at the Port Chicago Pier, already loaded with over 4,000 tons of explosives, while the SS Quinault Victory waited alongside to begin loading its own cargo. Small was not on the pier that night. Almost the entire shift on duty was. What caused the first detonation has never been established with certainty, because everyone close enough to have seen it did not survive to describe it. In under 2 seconds, both ships and the pier itself ceased to exist. The blast registered as a 3.4 magnitude earthquake at Berkeley's seismograph, 48 miles away. Windows shattered in San Francisco. People felt the ground move in Boulder City, Nevada, 430 miles distant. A column of fire and debris rose 12,000 feet into the night sky, visible for miles along the coast. 320 men died in that instant, 202 of them black enlisted sailors. Only 51 bodies were ever intact enough to identify. There was, in the most literal sense possible, nothing left to bury for the rest. The surviving sailors at the base, the ones not on the pier that night, were given a few days to clear wreckage and recover what remained of their friends, then told to prepare to return to work. White officers were granted 30 days of leave to recover from the shock. Black sailors were not. The Navy's official court of inquiry convened 4 days later, interviewed over 100 witnesses, produced a report running to 1,200 pages, and concluded it could not determine an exact cause of the explosion. It cleared every white officer at Port Chicago of any responsibility. And in its final pages, in the careful language of a document that expected to be read only by other officers, it offered its own theory instead, stating plainly that black sailors were, in its words, neither temperamentally nor intellectually capable of handling high explosives. 320 men had just died under a system with no training and no safety procedure, and the official conclusion of the United States Navy was that the men themselves were the defect. On August 9, 1944, the surviving divisions were ordered to Mare Island Naval Shipyard to resume loading ammunition, under the same officers, with no new training, no new safety equipment, and no acknowledgement that anything needed to change. When the order came down, the men were assembled on a parade ground, and one by one they were asked to step forward and begin work, and one by one, in a spreading, unplanned refusal that started with a handful of men and then simply kept growing, 258 sailors did not step forward. Their reasoning, recorded again and again by the officers sent to individually pressure them, was almost identical from man to man and almost embarrassingly reasonable. They were not refusing to serve their country. Many of them explicitly volunteered for combat duty in the Pacific instead. They were refusing to do the one job that had just killed 320 of their friends, under the exact conditions that had killed them, with nothing changed. The Navy's answer to 258 frightened, grieving young men was to confine them to a barge under armed guard and interrogate them one at a time, warning each of them that refusing a direct order in wartime could be charged as mutiny, and that mutiny, under the Articles of War, carried a maximum sentence of death. Over the following days, 208 of them, worn down by threats to their lives, their futures, and in some cases their families back home, agreed to return to the work. 50 men did not. We need to pause here on exactly what that number cost, because it is easy to read 50 as a small number and move on. It was not small to the men who chose it. Every one of them had already watched what that work could do to a human body. Every one of them understood that the officers pressuring them controlled their entire future in the Navy, their discharge status, their benefits, and now, potentially, their lives. And every one of them, alone in a room with an officer telling them to say yes, said no anyway. Among them was Joseph Small, the 23-year-old from Charleston who had voiced safety concerns before the explosion and who would later be singled out by prosecutors as a ringleader, a label he spent the rest of his life rejecting. He said, simply, that he had made up his mind to obey any order except one that sent him back to load ammunition, because he was afraid of it, and he believed that fear, under these specific circumstances, was the only rational response left to him. On September 5, 1944, all 50 men were formally charged with mutiny, the most serious offense in military law short of treason, carrying a maximum penalty of execution. The trial began on September 14th at Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay, and it remains, to this day, the largest mutiny trial in the history of the United States Navy. 50 defendants, one white defense counsel, Lieutenant Gerald Veltman, tasked with representing all of them at once, despite the fact that some of the men had genuinely different levels of involvement and, under any ordinary standard of law, arguably needed separate representation and separate consideration. 7 judges, all of them white naval officers, all of them men whose careers depended on the principle that orders exist to be obeyed regardless of the circumstances behind them. Many of the defendants were teenagers from poor, segregated communities with limited schooling, and on the stand, some struggled simply to find the words a courtroom expected. The prosecution did not need them to be eloquent. It only needed them to admit, one after another, that an order had been given and that they had said no. Sitting in that courtroom for 12 straight days, taking notes he was not authorized to submit as evidence, was a 36-year-old Knock attorney named Thurgood Marshall, 4 years from his first major Supreme Court victory and 2 decades from becoming the first black justice ever to sit on that court. Marshall could not represent the men directly. What he could do was watch, and afterward tell the country what he had watched. He held a press conference declaring that the prosecution's entire case rested on treating fear as a crime, and he said, in the sentence that newspapers across the country would carry, that this was not 50 men on trial for mutiny, but the Navy on trial for its whole vicious policy toward its own black sailors. The prosecution's argument never changed, and in its own narrow terms it was airtight. An order was given. It was refused. Under military law, that is mutiny, and the reasons behind the refusal, however sympathetic, are legally beside the point. The defense argued that men who were willing to sail into combat were, by definition, not cowards, and that refusing one specific, deadly task under one specific set of unchanged, negligent conditions was not an attempt to overthrow military authority. It did not matter. On October 24, 1944, after exactly 80 minutes of deliberation, the court convicted all 50 men of mutiny. 80 minutes, for 50 separate human beings, works out to under 2 minutes of consideration per defendant. Among those convicted was a sailor with a broken wrist, physically incapable of loading a single crate that month. Among them were 2 more men who had been medically excused from loading duty entirely before the explosion ever happened. It did not matter. They had been present on that parade ground. They were guilty. Sentences ran from 8 to 15 years of hard labor, and every one of the 50 received a dishonorable discharge, stripping them of every benefit their service might otherwise have earned them. Before we go further into what these 50 men carried for the rest of their lives, and it is a longer road than most stories like this one ever bother to walk, I want to ask something small of you. If a story like this is worth finding and worth telling completely, with the men's actual names instead of just a headline number, that is the entire reason this channel exists, and subscribing costs you nothing and tells me to keep digging up the ones most people never hear. Now, back to Treasure Island, because the men who lost that day were not finished losing yet. The 50 men were sent to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in Southern California to begin serving their sentences. Outside the prison walls, the case refused to stay quiet. The knockup publicized it nationally. Black newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender chief among them, ran the story in detail no white paper would touch. Eleanor Roosevelt herself raised concerns about the verdict. None of it overturned a single conviction, but it built pressure that did not exist before, and pressure, in this particular story, is the only currency that ever moved anything at all. The war in the Pacific ended in August of 1945, and with it went the desperate wartime need to keep ammunition moving at any cost. In January of 1946, under sustained public pressure, the Secretary of the Navy commuted the sentences. The men were released after serving roughly 16 months of what had been, on paper, up to 15 years. They were not exonerated. They were given general discharges, better than dishonorable, but still nowhere near the honorable discharge every other sailor who had served received. They went home carrying a legal record that called them mutineers, to communities that had followed every day of the trial in the black press and knew exactly what that record actually meant. The immediate human cost of Port Chicago did not end with the sentences either. The disaster itself accelerated something already stirring in the country. The case became one of the most cited examples when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July of 1948, formally ending racial segregation in the United States Armed Forces. The men who forced that reckoning by refusing to die quietly for a system that valued their lives at less than a shipping schedule would spend the better part of the next half-century watching that reckoning arrive for everyone except themselves. Joseph Small went home and lived a private life, rarely discussing Port Chicago publicly, carrying his conviction quietly for decades. Freddie Meeks, another of the 50, became one of the case's most persistent advocates, spending years pushing for the exoneration the Navy refused to grant. In December of 1999, President Bill Clinton granted Meeks a presidential pardon. A pardon forgives a sentence. It does not erase a conviction. Meeks was grateful for the gesture and said, more than once, that it was not the same thing as being told he had done nothing wrong, because legally, a pardoned man is still a guilty man the government has simply chosen not to punish further. For the next 2 decades, the fight moved to Congress, one bill at a time. California Congressman George Miller introduced legislation seeking exoneration in the 1990s, requesting a presidential pardon based on a modern understanding of trauma and discrimination that simply did not exist as a legal concept in 1944. It died in committee. His successor, Congressman Mark DeSaulnier, inherited the fight starting in 2015 and reintroduced legislation again in 2019, again in 2021, and again in 2022. Each time, the bill stalled. The Department of Defense's official position, restated as recently as a Navy review completed in 2021, was that the convictions had been legally sound under the military justice standards of 1944, even while acknowledging, in the very same document, that the working conditions had been unsafe, the training inadequate, and the underlying segregation unjust. Legally correct and morally indefensible were allowed, officially, to sit side by side in the same government filing for 77 years, while every man who could have told his own version of that story in his own words grew old, and in almost every case, died still waiting. That is where the story sat until a Navy General Counsel named Sean Coffey was assigned to take one more look at the trial record, this time all the way back to the original court-martial itself, not just the sentences that followed it. What Coffey's review found was not a matter of sympathy. It was a matter of law. 50 men had been tried together in a single proceeding despite having individually conflicting interests, a basic violation of the right to an adequate defense. They had been assigned only a handful of lawyers between all 50 of them, and the trial itself had been rushed to a verdict before the Navy's own court of inquiry into the explosion. The document containing 19 separate safety recommendations for handling ammunition had even been finalized, meaning the men convicted of refusing unsafe work were denied the one piece of evidence that would have proven, in the Navy's own words, exactly how unsafe that work had been. On July 17, 2024, 80 years to the day after the SEA Bryan disappeared from the face of the earth, Secretary of the Navy Carlos del Toro stood at the Port Chicago Memorial during the 80th commemoration of the disaster and formally set aside every court-martial connected to the incident. The 50 men convicted of mutiny and 208 more sailors who had been quietly punished with lesser summary courts-martial for the same act of refusal. 258 records corrected in a single afternoon. Del Toro had personally called Reverend Diana McDaniel, president of the Friends of Port Chicago, ahead of the announcement, a courtesy she said meant more to her than the paperwork that followed it. Thurgood Marshall had written, in his original 1944 appeal, that justice in this case would require nothing less than a complete reversal of the findings against them. It took the country 80 years. But on that afternoon, standing on the same ground where the pier once stood, it finally did exactly that. By the time the announcement was made, every single one of the Port Chicago 50 had already died. The last of them did not live to hear his name officially cleared. Their families received letters instead, corrected service records, and, for some, the quiet ability to finally claim veterans' benefits that had been withheld from their fathers and grandfathers for 8 decades. Joseph Small passed away in 1992. Freddie Meeks died in 2003, 4 years after his partial pardon, and 21 years before the full exoneration he had spent his whole later life demanding. Neither man ever got to hear the words the Navy finally said in 2024. So, here is what actually happened at Port Chicago, stripped down to what it always was underneath the legal language. 320 men died because the Navy handed the most dangerous job in its entire wartime operation to sailors it had already decided, by policy, were worth less than the white officers standing safely up the pier. 50 more men were told to do it again under identical conditions, and when they said the one word the Navy could not tolerate hearing from a black sailor in 1944, they were charged with a crime that carried a death sentence, and convicted in less time than it takes to watch this video. Whatever the Navy called it in 1944, the men on that parade ground were not committing mutiny. They were the only people in the entire chain of command who had correctly calculated the actual risk of the job, and they were punished for being right before anyone in a position of authority was willing to admit it. It took the United States government 80 years, a formal legal review, and the exact same July date on the calendar to finally say so out loud. Joseph Small, Freddie Meeks, and 256 other men did not live to hear it. They deserved to. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind most channels won't slow down long enough to get right, stay subscribed, because there is a lot more of this war still waiting to be told correctly.